You're listening to the Bahai World News Service.
Now live local house of worship.
Naglilingkod kay Bahá'í.
In this episode, we hear from Blas Cruz, a member of the Continental Board of Counsellors for the Americas, about family groups in the Ecuadorian port cities of Manta and Jaramillo, now numbering around 60, who are learning to walk a shared path, opening a bank of school supplies for families who can't afford them, reclaiming neighborhood soccer fields as safe spaces for young people, and carrying prayers out to sea with the fishermen who spend months away from home. It's a story of families discovering, together, what it takes to build a haven of peace. From the Bahai World News Service, this is Insights from the Field, a podcast series that provides first-hand accounts of specific Bahai efforts in the field of action.
Voy a compartir experiencias de grupos de familias.
I will share some experiences of groups of families in Ecuador and how they are learning to foster environments based in principles such as unity, justice, and equality between men and women.
Principalmente voy a centrarme en la
I'm mainly going to focus on the city of Manta, which is a coastal city on Ecuador's Pacific coast.
Ecuador.
A very important port city, it has around 500,000 inhabitants, and the other locality is called Jaramillo.
Jaramillo es una localidad un poco más pequeña, de alrededor de
Jaramillo is a somewhat smaller locality of around 40,000 people.
donde la vida
It's also a port where the life of its population revolves around fishing, boats, and the sea.
y el mar. Pero también es una localidad
But it's also a locality that's between rural and urban. A few years ago, some families began to take part in conversations about how to improve the conditions of their environment, both material and spiritual. So they began to create spaces for conversation. Initially, the population that responded most were the youth, bringing hundreds of young people into these spaces because they offered unity, love, fellowship. Healthy spaces full of joy, but also free of vices and many negative aspects. So we began to focus on some neighborhoods to try to learn together with these families. Particularly, something that caught these families' attention was that the Baha'i community was offering a space without any prejudice, open to everyone, enabling people to contribute.
Mejorar la iluminación de la calle.
At first, the early conversations were about things like improving the street lighting, making sure that trash wasn't on the ground, and that dogs didn't get into it. And little by little, they began introducing increasingly deeper concepts, like the principle of unity. How is unity built? And of course, at first, there are some ideas within this principle that can be simple, like, let's be happy together. But they realized that unity is something much deeper, and they began to look at what it was that built unity or could build unity in their neighborhoods. They identified some aspects, such as access to education, and also the issue of equality between men and women. So, on the issue of access to education, some of these families find it difficult to be constantly buying school supplies and uniforms for their children every year. So they realized that some children were enrolling in the neighborhood school, but then would stop their study. And the parents discovered that the reason was that the children didn't have the necessary school supplies, and they didn't have shoes or uniforms either. So some of these mothers and fathers began collecting, throughout the year, the shoes their children had outgrown and the uniforms that other other friends were no longer using. They also recycled the notebooks that were left over. These families began to provide a bank of school supplies and uniforms to make sure more families had the opportunity for their children to access education. This clearly brought greater unity to the neighborhood, because then all the families were consulting about who had certain items they could donate. And the families who were receiving these materials didn't have a feeling that, okay, we are the poor people of the neighborhood, but rather, we are also contributing in other ways to advance this principle of unity. Another aspect that also caught their attention was that in this city, as in the rest of the country, people are very into soccer. They love soccer. It's like the passion of the youth. And since they live along the shore, they generally use the beach as their field, to play at the edge of the sea. But what these families noticed was that these spaces, instead of offering a safe environment of fellowship and support, were environments where there was alcohol for sale, and possibly a small-scale drug trafficking. There was also inappropriate language among everyone taking part in the game. If we are meeting and talking every week, sometimes every night, to see how we can improve our conditions, material, intellectual, and spiritual. But when we go play sports, we behave the way we used to behave before. What's the difference? So they began to identify that one of the things they needed to improve was how people treated one another during sports. So how are these qualities that they were learning through the programs and materials offered by the Baha'i community put into practice? The families began to think about how we do this. How can we make sure that not just our children and our husbands and wives are in this environment, but the whole neighborhood? And they began thinking about this idea of creating neighborhood-level championships. But then they said, well, that already exists. What is different with what we will do? One of the things they did differently was to arrange so that everyone who's going to participate needs to understand some basic principles, like truthfulness, treating friends with courtesy, having some understanding of the issue of men and women, and how they relate to one another.
Cómo se relacionan entre sí. Entonces, estos amigos
these friends began opening up a discussion space a week beforehand, so that all the neighbors interested in taking part in the championship could connect with the educational materials offered by the Baha'i community. What they are seeing now in sports in the neighborhood is that every time their children get together, the amount of alcohol around where young people play soccer has decreased considerably. Another aspect these families are also learning and trying to understand more and more deeply are relationships within a family. What is the role of women? What is the role of men? Something that has helped a lot is a quote of Abdul Baha, in where he mentions that a family is like a nation in miniature. So, what is the role of the children? How do children respond to their parents? What responsibility do parents have toward their children? This is what has been seen in recent years in these localities, where the population accessing moral education is rising and the school dropout rate is decreasing. And that has a lot to do with the conversations that happen within the family and from within the groups of families who are concerned. Not with who's doing better than the other, but with how everyone is progressing. Because, on one hand, it's relatively easy to be united when everything is going well. But what happens when difficulties arise? What we have seen is how they have come together, how everyone helps each other when someone is sick. These groups of families keep track of what's needed. If there's an elderly person who has no one to take them to the hospital, then the neighbors organize themselves and make sure that person gets care. Also, when someone has passed away, these families respond quickly by organizing not only the logistical side of the burial and the funeral, but also taking great care to create a devotional and a spiritual atmosphere to bid farewell to that soul. The concern is that the social and security situation in Ecuador has been getting worse and worse in recent years. That has direct implications for families and for these groups of families, of course. One group of families is focused on helping young people between 12 and 15 years old participate in a program that helps them foster a life of service. In this group of families, some parents are serving as facilitators of these programs. Generally, since it's a fishing community, the men spend long periods of time at sea. They stay out at sea fishing for around 2 or 3 months. And when they come back, they don't have a posture of, okay, I'm here now, you have to take care of me. Instead, the first question these men ask is, how's the study going? They take up the baton and continue facilitating the study of the program for their children. And they also come back with the stories of how, out at sea, they've been saying prayers. This group of families has started to put together materials that let them, while they're out fishing, to have a devotional moment when their soul stay directly connected with God. So, at first, they would bring prayer books onto the boat, but then they realized that the books would quickly get wet if they were dropped, which made them sad. So the families began to explore how they could bring their prayer books out to the sea without damaging them. So they print out the prayers and put them in plastic. These men aren't just bringing home a living for their families, but while they're at work, they're also creating spaces that nourish that devotional character, not only in themselves, but in others around them too. So the effect is that when they come back to port, many other families begin connecting with these groups of families through prayer. Initially, because their husbands were connected by those others who had already been connected earlier while at sea. So they come home and start saying, look, my friend at work on the boat gave me these prayers. I really like this one. He told me a lot about the programs you all are involved in. And this is one of the ways these groups of families have also been growing across these 2 localities, both in Manta and in Jaramillo. And now, there are around 60 groups of families continually consulting on how to build a better society.
Otro de los programas que ofrece es el programa de preparación.
Another one of the programs is the Preparation for Social Action program. Some members of these groups of families, generally young people, are enabling them to become more aware of how they can contribute to improving society through social action.
A la mejora de la sociedad a través de la acción social. Un aspecto que estas familias han
One aspect these families have been able to
identificar a lo
identify
largo
over the
de
years of
consultas
consultation
durante estos años
was that some young people
fue
and
que
children in the neighborhood
algunos
were
jóvenes
struggling
y
academically
niños
at school.
del barrio
Some of them were failing a grade, while
teniendo un
others
mal
were
desempeño
dropping
en el
out
colegio,
because it was too
académicamente, en la
hard for
escuela.
them.
Algunos de ellos estaban perdiendo el año, otros se retiraban porque se les hacía muy difícil. Entonces estas familias comenzaron
So these
a
families began to
pensar
think,
qué podemos hacer
what can we do
para
so our
evitar
children
que
don't
nuestros
fail the school
hijos
year or drop
pierdan el año
out?
escolar o se
Knowing
retiren.
that they themselves
Entonces,
didn't have the
sabiendo que
academic
ellos
background
mismos
needed
no
to
están en
help
una
their children move
posición
forward academically,
intelectual
they
muy
began asking
avanzada
other
que
friends
permita
who
que
might be
puedan
able to
ayudarles a
offer
sus hijos a
classes in
avanzar
math, science,
académicamente.
history,
Entonces
and
comenzaron
English.
a preguntar a otros amigos quienes pudieran ayudarles también a ofrecer clases de matemáticas, de ciencias, de historia, de inglés. Entonces, este grupo de familias
This group of
comenzaron a buscar a
families
estas
began
personas
looking
y a
for these
pedirles que
people
si podían
and
ellos
asking them
ofrecer
if they could offer
algunas
some
tardes de
afternoons of
servicio
service
para
for
sus
their
hijos y
children
asegurar
to make
entonces que
sure that they'd
avancen.
move
Y el
forward.
resultado ha sido
And the result has
que
been
el
that the percentage of young
de
people and
jóvenes y
children
niños que
failing the
están
school
perdiendo el
year
año escolar se ha
has dropped
reducido
drastically.
drásticamente. Porque muchos de los padres no han podido terminar la educación secundaria. Pero cuando uno pregunta a ellos y conversa con ellos,
Because many of
la
the
respuesta
parents
es como,
weren't
no, yo
able to
quiero
finish
que mi
secondary
hijo o
school
mi hija
themselves.
termine la
But when
escuela
you ask them
secundaria
and talk
y que
with them,
también
the
vaya a la
answer is that
universidad
no,
o
I
estudie
want
algo
my son,
técnico.
my
Yo
daughter,
quiero
to
que
finish
mis
secondary
hijos
school,
me
go to
superen en todo
university,
sentido.
or
Eso es lo que
study
ellos
something
mencionan, no
technical.
solo
I want my
material,
children to
intelectualmente,
surpass
sino
me
también
in every way.
espiritualmente. Algo
That's
que
what they
ellos
say,
reflexionan es cómo
not just
ven
materially and
que estos
intellectually,
jóvenes
but
están siendo
also
pilares en el
spiritually.
desarrollo de una nueva realidad para estos barrios. Y sí, no, todavía no es el paraíso en el que ellos
Something they
desean
reflect
vivir,
on
pero
is how they
sí se
see
nota
these
un
young
avance
people becoming
significativo
pillars
desde el
in the
momento que ellos
development of a new
comenzaron a
reality
consultar
for these
y el
neighborhoods.
cambio también
And
físico
no,
que estos
it's
barrios
not yet the
están
paradise
trayendo.
they
Muchos de
wish
estos
for,
barrios
but you can see
viven
a
en
significant advance since the
zonas
moment they began to
periféricas de
consult.
estas ciudades
And you also
y
see
por lo
the
tanto no
physical
son muy
change in these
visibles para la
neighborhoods.
sociedad.
Many
Entonces,
of these neighborhoods are on the
tradicionalmente son
outskirts
lugares
of these
donde la
cities,
basura está en
and they're
medio de
not
la
very visible to
calle, no hay mucho
society.
orden, no
Typically,
hay mucha
they're places
belleza
where
física
trash sits
alrededor.
right in the
Entonces,
middle of the
estos
street.
grupos de familias
There's not
también han
much order,
comenzado a
not much
avanzar
physical beauty
sobre este
around.
aspecto y
So
diciendo
these groups of
como nosotros
families have
vivimos
begun to
acá,
make
nosotros
progress on
somos los
this
dueños de estas
aspect,
casas,
saying,
porque estamos
we live
esperando
here.
que
We are
otras
the
personas
owners of this
vengan y nos
house.
organicen el
Why are we
barrio.
waiting
Estas
for other
familias,
people to
a la
come and
luz
organize our
de los
neighborhood for
estudios de estos
us?
materiales y de
All
el
these families,
incremento
in
de
light of
su
everything they're
conciencia,
studying
de su
and the
entorno,
increase
han
in their
comenzado
awareness of
una
their
serie de
surroundings,
campañas,
have
no
begun a
solo de
series of projects,
limpieza,
not
también
just of
de
cleanup, but also
reforestación
of
en los
reforestation in the
parques,
parks,
de
of
pintar los
repainting the
juegos con los
playground
que
equipment their
en los parques
children
sus
play on,
hijos
and
se
making sure the
entretienen,
lighting
de
is
asegurar que la
adequate.
iluminación
So,
sea la
little by
adecuada.
little,
Entonces,
you
poco a
can also
poco uno
see in a
puede
material
también ver
way
de manera
the power a
material
group of families
cómo
can
ese
generate
poder
in a small
que un
setting.
grupo de
Once
familia
it decides
puede
to
generar
take
en un
charge of its own
entorno pequeño
development,
una vez que
a
decide
community
tomar las
can
riendas
transform its
de su
reality
crecimiento, esa
constantly.
realidad va a ir cambiando y se va a ir transformando constantemente. Y algo que también se ha visto
And something that has also been seen in these groups of families is walking together on a path of service.
Realmente, cuando yo pienso en grupos de familia, yo estoy imaginándome como un camino que al inicio comenzó como
Really,
un
when
camino
I think
de
about groups of families,
tierra
I
en
imagine it
medio
like
de
a
una
road that at first
selva
started out as
o
a
de
dirt path
césped,
in the middle of a
y
jungle or a
luego,
field.
a medida que otras
And then,
familias se
as other
van
families kept
sumando y fueron
joining,
invitadas y se van sumando,
they
entonces
more
eso
kept
pasó a
joining,
ser una calle de
and the
tierra,
path became a
luego a
dirt
ser una
street.
calle
Then,
pavimentada,
it
con
became a street
cemento,
paved
pero
with
que en este
cement.
momento, en estos
Now, in these
lugares, lo que
places,
necesitamos
what
son
we
unas
need
grandes
are big
autopistas para
highways,
que de esta
so
manera
that in this way
podamos
we can have
tener el
enough
espacio
room for many more
suficiente donde
families
todas
to
estas
walk
familias
side
caminen a
by
la par.
side.
Y no quiere decir que no hay pruebas o dificultades. Claro que vienen las pruebas y dificultades, pero estas familias están
Now, it doesn't
aprendiendo
mean that there are
sobre
no
ese tema
trials
de
or
la
difficulties.
resiliencia, de
Of
cómo
course, trials and
cuando una
difficulties
familia se
come,
cae, el
but these
resto nos
families, they are
levanta
learning
y
resilience
seguimos caminando.
of how when
Entonces
one
no
family
estamos
falls, They just pick them up and keep walking. So we're not building a society that is pointing at the one who fell. These families are learning to build environments based on achievements, on love, on unity, on justice.
Muchos de estos pescadores han sufrido secuestros de mafias.
Manta is a city that has been deeply affected because many of these fishermen have suffered kidnappings by criminal gangs who use their boats to carry drugs out of the port. It's not something that people want to do, but it's something where they show up at the door and tell you, you have to do this or there will be consequences.
Están manteniéndose firmes.
So this community is learning how, despite all these serious difficulties where their lives are at risk, to remain steadfast. And something that I feel is at the heart of these families is that they've come to understand that if this principle of unity isn't at the center, together with that development of devotional character, it will be hard for them to be able to build those havens of peace they hope for their families. But right now, the question they have is about peace, about how to first build shelters, not only for young people, but for the whole family. How does one build a shelter big enough to hold all the families of a street or a neighborhood, where everyone can come in, where everyone can live in concord, in harmony, with unity? And this really fills one with hope, because it means that, in the end, what these families are building are these social spaces, these havens where peace will ultimately reign.
Estas familias lo que están construyendo son estos espacios, estos remansos, donde la paz al final va a reinar.
You've been listening to Insights from the Field, a podcast series from the Baha'i World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit bwns.org.